Mercantilist economic policies. Mercantilism was the dominant economic theory in Europe during the 16th to 18th centuries, marking the early modern period and coinciding with the rise of powerful nation-states. Mercantilism was not a uniform or codified system, but rather a set of economic policies and practices employed by European governments to maximize their wealth and power. These policies were rooted in the belief that national strength was directly tied to the accumulation of precious metals, gold and silver, and that economic prosperity could be achieved by ensuring a favorable balance of trade. 1. Overview of mercantilism. Mercantilism developed in a context where European nations were emerging from feudal systems and competing for global dominance, particularly in overseas colonies. The core belief of mercantilism was that wealth was finite, and to become a more powerful nation, a country needed to acquire as much of the world's wealth as possible. Unlike modern economic theories, which emphasize the benefits of free trade and market-driven economies, mercantilism was built on the idea of protectionism and state intervention in the economy. Key principles of mercantilism include wealth as gold and silver. Mercantilists believed that the wealth of a nation was measured by the amount of gold and silver it possessed. As a result, policies aimed at maximizing the accumulation of these precious metals were prioritized. Favorable balance of trade. The goal was to maintain a surplus in international trade, meaning that a nation would export more than it imported. This surplus would bring gold and silver into the country, increasing national wealth. Government intervention. Mercantilist policies often involved active government intervention in the economy to control trade, regulate industries, and direct the flow of goods. Governments used tariffs, monopolies, and subsidies to achieve their economic goals. Colonial expansion. European powers sought to acquire colonies to provide raw materials and serve as markets for manufactured goods. Colonies played a central role in the mercantilist economic system, as they allowed nations to bypass foreign competitors and extract resources directly. 2. Mercantilist economic policy. To achieve the goals of mercantilism, European governments employed a range of policies that sought to increase national wealth, regulate trade, and strengthen their economies. These policies were implemented through various mechanisms, including tariffs, monopolies, colonial exploitation, and the promotion of manufacturing. Protectionism and trade regulation. Protectionist policies were central to mercantilism. Governments imposed high tariffs and duties on imported goods to reduce foreign competition and protect domestic industries. This discouraged the importation of foreign goods while encouraging exports. Tariffs and import restrictions. By imposing tariffs on foreign goods, mercantilist states made it more expensive to import products from other countries. This encouraged domestic consumers and industries to buy locally produced goods, thereby keeping wealth within the country. For example, Britain imposed tariffs on imported French wines to support its domestic wine industry. Subsidies for exports. Governments often provided subsidies to domestic industries to encourage production for export. This made domestic products cheaper on the international market, helping the country export more goods and maintain a favorable balance of trade. Navigation acts. Countries like England introduced laws to ensure that their trade was conducted on national ships and with limited foreign interference. The English Navigation Acts 1651 were a series of laws that restricted the use of foreign ships for trade between England and its colonies, giving British merchants and sailors an advantage and ensuring that trade profits remained within the empire. Colonial exploitation. Colonialism was a critical aspect of mercantilist policies. European powers saw colonies as sources of raw materials and as markets for finished goods. Colonies were integral to the mercantilist system because they allowed the mother country to exploit resources and avoid reliance on foreign imports. Raw materials colonies supplied raw materials like sugar, tobacco, cotton, and timber that were essential for manufacturing in Europe. These materials were shipped back to the mother country, processed into finished goods, and then exported. The colonies themselves were prohibited from developing industries that might compete with the mother country. Exclusive trade colonial powers imposed monopolies and exclusive trade agreements that forced their colonies to trade only with the mother country. The colonies were restricted from trading with foreign nations or other colonial powers. For instance, Spain and Portugal tightly controlled trade with their colonies in Latin America, ensuring that the wealth generated from colonial resources flowed directly into the European economy. Slave trade, the triangular trade between Europe, Africa, and the Americas, was another significant element of mercantilism. European powers like Britain and France participated in the transatlantic slave trade, which provided labor for the colonies, particularly in plantation economies like those in the Caribbean. The profits from the slave trade contributed to the mercantilist goals of maximizing wealth and production. C. Promotion of manufacturing and domestic industry. Mercantilist policies aimed to stimulate domestic production and reduce dependency on foreign goods. Governments encouraged the growth of industries that could produce goods for both domestic consumption and export. State monopolies. Governments often granted monopolies to specific industries or companies to control production and trade. For example, the British East India Company and the Dutch East India Company were given exclusive rights to trade in certain regions, such as India and Southeast Asia. These monopolies were key players in global trade, bringing wealth to their respective countries. Industrial regulation. Mercantilist governments regulated manufacturing to ensure the production of high-quality goods that could compete on the international market. States provided financial support to strategic industries such as textiles, shipbuilding, and arms manufacturing to promote exports and strengthen national industries. Import substitution to reduce reliance on imported goods. Mercantilist states pursued policies of import substitution, which involved developing domestic industries that could produce goods previously imported from abroad. This ensured that a nation's wealth remained within its borders and minimized the outflow of capital. D. Balance of trade. A fundamental objective of mercantilist policy was to maintain a favorable balance of trade, where a country's exports exceeded its imports. This was seen as essential to accumulating gold and silver, the primary measures of wealth at the time. To achieve this, governments took measures to control the flow of goods in and out of the country. Export-oriented growth. Mercantilist economies focused on increasing exports by producing goods that could be sold abroad, especially in colonies and foreign markets. Luxury goods like textiles, fine furniture, and manufactured products were highly valued and exported in large quantities. Restricting imports. Imports were heavily restricted, as they were seen as draining national wealth. Governments placed high tariffs on foreign goods to make them more expensive and less attractive to consumers. This protectionism ensured that domestic industries thrived and that money stayed within the national economy. E. Mercantilist wars and economic rivalries. Because wealth was seen as finite in the mercantilist worldview, nations often engaged in wars and economic rivalries to secure resources, control trade routes, and gain access to valuable colonies. Anglo-Dutch wars. England and the Netherlands fought several wars During the 17th century, driven largely by mercantilist competition over trade and shipping dominance, England's Navigation Acts and Dutch commercial dominance sparked conflict, with both nations vying for control of lucrative overseas markets. Colonial wars. European powers frequently went to war over control of colonies and trade routes. The War of Spanish Succession 17 million, 11,714 and the 7 Years' War 17,561,763 were partly motivated by mercantilist ambitions, as nations sought to expand their colonial empires and secure greater access to resources and markets. 3. Impact of mercantilist policies. Mercantilist policies had a profound impact on the development of European economies and global trade patterns during the early modern period. Some of the key effects include rise of nation-states. Mercantilism helped strengthen the power of emerging nation-states, as governments took an active role in controlling the economy and regulating trade. Monarchs like Louis XIV of France and Elizabeth I of England implemented mercantilist policies to consolidate their power and increase national wealth. Colonial empires. European mercantilist policies led to the expansion of colonial empires, as nations sought to exploit resources and establish exclusive trade relationships with their colonies. This contributed to the globalization of trade and the rise of European dominance in world affairs. Increased state control. Mercantilism led to increased state intervention in the economy, with governments regulating industries, controlling trade, and granting monopolies to favored companies. This laid the groundwork for the development of modern, state-led economic policies.